everybody. My name is Matt Cook. I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. This is a web series that we've developed to help congregations that are in the midst of pastoral transitions. We do a lot of different things to help congregations, but our phone rings more often than for any other kind of work when we find ourselves talking to a chair of deacons or a chair of a search committee or a personnel committee or a clerk of a session, because their pastor has just retired, announced their retirement or their resignation, or in some unfortunate circumstances when the pastor has been asked to leave. And that's always a challenging situation. So we can't answer every single question that people would ask in a series like this, but what we want to try to do with this series is give answers to some of the more common questions, and especially the ones that people are thinking about as they're getting started. So hopefully you'll find the content of this. There's actually going to be multiple episodes in this series. This is actually episode 4. Before I get to the particular content of this episode, I would like to introduce our panel. Dr. Bill Owen, a pastor for 40 years in Middle Tennessee, in Baptist churches. Michelle Snyder is ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA and is a licensed clinical social worker. And Dr. David Brubaker is the retired dean of the School of Graduate Studies and Professions at Eastern Mennonite University. I think I got that right, David. So
close enough.
Yeah, and he's really happy to be retired. You should have seen him before. So it's good to have all three of you with us. A lot of expertise at the table today. What we're going to focus on today in particular is power dynamics. Now, I know when I say that, if I'm you, almost immediately you probably tense up a little bit. Hopefully you're sitting there thinking, well, in my church there are no power dynamics. Like we're getting along just fine. Like we're a warm and loving fellowship. And I hope that that's true for everybody that's listening. But one of the things that we'll tell you is, like, when your pastor steps away, that does create a vacuum. And even unintentionally, sometimes people start things that are taken for granted are no longer taken for granted. And if nothing else, there are different parts of the system that have to learn to function slightly differently in the absence of a pastor. And so part of what we want to do is we want to help you spot some of these tendencies in congregations. They're fairly common. We're going to talk about why that's true in this episode and give you some practical advice on to spot it before it happens and to know what to do when it does happen. So pastor transitions don't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot of stuff that's taking place, this challenging and anxious time in the American church. So when a congregation finds itself in the middle of a pastor transition, it's often bringing some bags along with them. Some stuff comes along for the ride. So what I want to talk about first is, what is some of that stuff that comes along for the ride in the midst of that season of transition? David, let's start with you.
So every congregation is unique, and whatever is going on in that congregation prior to a transition will become more salient, more relevant during the transition itself. I've been influenced by William Bridges' work in transitions, and he talks about the importance of being attentive to the transition zone, that space between some kind of ending and some kind of new beginning, which really could be called the anxiety zone, because what happens most is anxiety goes up during a transition. It's unsettling. Bridges uses the example of the children of Israel going from Egypt into the wilderness and eventually starting to say, we just want to go back to Egypt because at least we knew what to expect there. And that's what tends to happen in a transition. It's unsettling and anxiety producing, made even worse these days because of the reality of broader societal polarization and the increasing pace of change that we're all experiencing.
Michelle, what about you? When you get that telephone call and there's somebody on the other end and you're talking to people inside that system, what are you seeing about what they're bringing with them?
Yeah, so I appreciate what David said. I think he's absolutely right that what happens in a transition is just sort of an accentuation of, or an acceleration of, or what has been present in the system all along. Most of the spaces I work in are mainline spaces, and it probably is a little more true in the mainline than other places. It's true in American Christianity that we're getting older and our churches are getting smaller, and there's this extreme anxiety about young people and aging congregations. And so lots of times people see a pastoral transition as an opportunity to get a young pastor with small children who's going to become the superhero that saves the day in the church. And I think a kind of myopia can set in for nominating committees, for search committees when this happens, where they're looking for someone young. And I heard Bill Owen say on a previous episode of this, we talk a lot about how the work of transition is discernment work. It's spiritual discernment work. And there's a young pastor with small children is not the answer for every church. And so that's what I see, is the anxiety of that particular dynamic showing up in churches during times of transition.
All right, Bill, what about from your perspective?
Generally in the first conversation that I have with the church, that, the major focus is on how do we get the right pastor, the next best fit, who's going to come in and so many words, save us or lead us, on to greater victory, or that's all anxiety driven. It's always present. That's not a bad thing. That's a human thing. Anxiety, and it in so many words, is really just uncertainty about, what do we do next? What's the best way forward? And the reality is, and I think this helps all of us. We're humans. And the church is no different. My granddaddy was a pig farmer in Mississippi, and he used to say, "Billy, if you have pigs, you have problems." And churches have people in them. And so we're emotional beings. So, that's family system stuff, I know. But the fact is that the church in times of transition are like the mobile hanging over the baby crib. And when something shakes, we all shake. So it's okay. So relax and just recognize that this is an emotional period to be in. So I think if you're on a search committee, it's important to recognize that the pressure that you're feeling, it's normal. The search itself, there's going to be some new learning there, because we're in the 21st century now. It's not like it used to be. It's changed, no doubt about that. Some of that might be cultural. Some of that might be just background emotional stuff going on in your system, but you can do this. And I think that one of the strengths that someone from outside the system can bring to a church that is in emotion and motion is that we can bring methodologies like spiritual discernment, as Michelle said, like strength-based inquiry, appreciative thinking, collaborative leadership, all of the emotional intelligence even. How can we be our best selves? And I think, to me, that's helpful to the congregation when the leadership can lean into those kinds of behaviors that are learned and that you can do. So I'd say be encouraged.
So
My favorite thing about what you
ahead,
just
Michelle.
said is that now I have permission to call you Billy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I've heard the pig story before, but that's definitely one that's going to stick with us, right?
Oh
Michelle?
yeah, for sure.
Mississippi pig farmer. That's right.
So all of those issues tend to they don't all stay beneath the surface all the time. So I don't want to overstate that, but in a lot of congregations, there are things that stay kind of behind closed doors, if you will. Like maybe there was a discussion about the particular issue 6 years ago or 10 years ago, and maybe the church worked through some things, and maybe not everybody loved the solution or felt like the problem was solved to their extent. But you get used to it. Like it's like in a marriage, right? You after a while you realize it's just not worth fighting about. It's not worth bringing it forward. But then a pastor steps away, and all bets are off, if you will. And people start to want to talk about those things that were settled for the system, that in the absence of that leader become unsettled again. That's part of the uncertainty. So
Matt, can I say something about this? Just popped to my mind. Uh, David was citing William Bridges. I I remember Russ Crabtree's that little book,
Transition apparitions.
Transition Apparitions, talking about what's going on in the congregation. I think committee members should realize this, that everybody in the system is disturbed by transition, the change that comes, sometimes immediate, sometimes you've been expecting it, but no matter, it's still the same. And so they're asking all kinds of questions. And I remember Russ, and it's research based. I mean, the inability to ask, what's going to happen to our church? The inability to know, what, even to be able, how do we tell someone what we do here at church, and why we do it, and what our vision is for all of those things can be paralyzing when you start thinking about the past, present, and future of the church. Those are big questions. Why did the pastor resign? Is there something that we don't know? Why does this keep happening? Maybe the church has been through a cycle of these, what if we just hire a young pastor? That should solve everything, right? So there are just all kinds of these unanswered questions, and oftentimes undiscussed, that have to be faced, and that can be overwhelming.
The only pushback I would say is, well, I think that is absolutely true for a portion of the congregation. In the same way, a pastor transition can also can unleash energy, not just anxiety, right?
Oh, yeah.
You'll have some people that are like, finally, now we're going to address this. Finally, now we're going to talk about this. Finally, now this is going to change and improve. And all that's happening at the same time. It's like a fire hose that all of a sudden the team of firemen that are there, they all let go of it, and the hose is just going all over the place. You don't know exactly where it's going to go. That's the energy that can be unleashed in the midst of a transition.
And it's dynamic energy.
It is dynamic, and it can be very generative. It can be a positive thing too. But what I want to stop and talk about now is not what's fueling it, not what are the issues, but like when that happens, like the previous pastor was almost certainly helping manage that, helping the system stay integrated. But then the pastor leaves, right? What happens next? What do people do in that moment, Bill? Like, what have you seen that people start? How do the people start to react to the fact that now there's a vacuum?
Well, people, particularly leaders of certain groups in the church or whatever, will rush to fill that vacuum.
Yeah.
And so that might show itself in a Sunday school class. It might reveal itself in a parking lot meeting. All kinds of things can. We've all seen that in the churches that we've either attended or led as pastors. So that's a normal human reaction. A vacuum power's going to rush to fill it. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, we call it the grabbing the steering wheel effect, right? When suddenly there's nobody behind the steering wheel, a variety of people will start reaching for the steering wheel. Not everybody will do it. Some of that can be because of temperament, personality of the leader. Some of that can be because of the issues that we named. But
it can be out of fear, or maybe just a desire for clarity. Just I need an answer.
Staff can end up reaching for the steering wheel too. That can happen in the midst of it. So David, you do a lot of conflict work, right? So how often do you see when that happens? How often do you see conflict arise in the midst of pastoral transition?
Yeah, I call my work with congregations around change and conflict. Sometimes it's purely strategic planning. But in conflict cases, my first congregational case was in 1987, so I've been at this for almost 40 years. And I would summarize what I see as fights over leadership as coming down to what I call PIP. It's usually about power, identity, or purpose. It's about power, which you named earlier, identity, who are we, and purpose, why do we exist? And it's much healthier to have the who are we and why do we exist conversations before going to hire a pastor than it is in the midst of the tension around which person are we going to invite. So if we can get clear about power, we can talk about that. Authority is a legitimate conversation, but particularly around identity and purpose, we're more likely to make the kind of hire that would be appropriate for our congregation.
So this wasn't a church that we worked with. It was a church that was pastored by a friend of mine, and he retired. And some of these issues were kind of beneath the surface. So this is a large church, kind of a center set church, right? So you have red and blue under one roof. You have some people who lean left theologically and people who lean right theologically, all under one roof. And he was very much a peacemaker by personality, which means they didn't always talk about the things that they disagreed with. And then when he announced his retirement, a group of people kind of campaigned to get certain people elected to the search committee. And that search committee wasn't representative of the entire congregation. And they brought a candidate. And in a lot of systems, right, when a search committee recommends a candidate, right, there's a kind of a default assumption that we're going to choose this person. We trust a search committee to bring a candidate, but then people started to ask questions. And the more they started to ask questions, the more they started to realize that an agenda had driven both the election of multiple people on the search committee and this particular candidate. And they brought this candidate, and the candidate got less than 40% of the vote, right? Which will tell you, you probably know this instinctively if you're watching this as a member of a church, but about the worst outcome you can get is a vote that's anywhere around 50%. Because that means there's a lot of people on both sides of the issue, which means you've set yourself up for conflict. And in that particular case, in the absence of a pastor where the stakes are so high, it was incredibly high stakes and a tremendous amount of conflict. And now we're almost 2 years removed from that, and the church is still in a healing posture. And they lost a lot of people as a result of that. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. I want to go too far down the conflict road. We could spend a whole hour just talking about that. But when we talk about the steering wheel effect, it is common for issues that have been, or at least people have treated as resolved, to quickly get unresolved. And if they aren't dealt with a lot of intentionality, it can cause a lot of damage in a system. So
I want to just comment on what David said. I appreciate that PIP thing. I'm going to use that because what I said about the aging and declining and where are the young people and that whole thing in a church, like I always say that those are anxiety responses, right? Like every single church in America is not called to be a church for young families with small children. And yet it's sort of our default go-to in the aftermath. And it's because of a lack of identity. The two of the most vibrant churches I've ever worked with, one was in Florida and one was in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Some of the most vibrant ministry I've ever seen, some of the most robust worship, like had average ages of 73, 74, 75. And those were churches that were called to minister to older adults, but ask them what they wanted, young families with small children. And so what I'm saying is I appreciate that when it comes right down to it, identity is the answer to that question, that helping churches think about identity in the absence of that, in the vacuum of that, you'll get these default answers that are not helpful, that become myopic, and that can steer the church in a wrong direction. Yeah, that's good.
And I just to echo that, I think the strongest part of our process as we work with churches in transition is around identity clarification.
Yeah.
That's our best work. It's the greatest gift to any church, to become clear and have a compelling shared vision that operates out of the best of who they are. If you're a committee member, it doesn't matter what the challenge that you face. If you bring your best self to meet the challenges of the 21st century, whatever's coming, it'll be enough. Your best selves will be enough. that's God's gift to the church and God's
Good word,
presence in
Bill.
the church. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we can get clear about who we are as a congregation and why we exist, we will attract ministerial candidates who also are clear about who
Oh,
they are and why they exist. And it's a much better match.
much, much better.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The pool of candidates will, I mean, that narrative alone, here's a church that's worked and is clear about who they are
Yeah.
in God's kingdom. That will sell. That will
On the
recruit.
flip side, I'll
Yeah.
say most of the conflict jobs I've done, not since 1987, but I've done a few.
You just call David old? Is that what you just?
You know,
That,
give or
that was
take.
hurtful. That was hurtful.
Most of the conflict jobs that I have done, at least around transition, have been because the church hasn't been able to be honest about its identity
Yeah.
and has told the wrong story. You know, we tell a story about ourselves, people believe it, and so anyway, yeah, that identity work is important.
Yeah, identity work can feel risky for congregations because they feel like in an era of decline that clarifying their identity is going to be saying no to some people that are a part of their community, and that's hard. And it is that's a challenge. But in the end, a couple of things can be true. One, you don't all have to agree on every issue to have a clear identity, right? That does not have to be true.
Right.
And two, being able to articulate who you are ultimately. I mean, there's a woman named Brene Brown. We talk about her as an organization that we quote her all the time. Clarity is kindness. This idea that one of the best things that you can do, not only for your organization, but for individuals that are considering whether they want to be a part of your community, is to give a clear statement of clear sense of what they're getting to be a part of. So,
Yeah.
and the church is bigger. The church
Yeah.
capital C is bigger than any one individual congregation. That's the other thing. We don't have to put all the weight of being all things to all people on our shoulders. So
I've heard you say that so much, Matt. I thought you were the one that said it. I didn't.
no. That's I'm quoting Saint Brene in that regard. So
I think it's one of the real gifts of our transition process that's really based around identity work is that in a group of 8 to 10 sitting around a table, we can share from our deepest selves what's significant to us and come away realizing, hey, Matt doesn't think the way I do, or Michelle has a different opinion about that, and yet we feel closer and more. I've been in progressive churches and the most conservative, right to left, and I've not been in one where there hasn't been diversity, where there haven't been still issues that need to be named and shared and come away saying clarity, like you said, Matt. That's a real gift to the 21st century church, I think, and we don't have those conversations enough.
So I want to shift a little bit. So we talked about the stuff that people bring to the table and it causes them to kind of to try to grab the steering wheel a little bit. And one of the things that every church is going to be dealing with in a transition is, how do we interpret, what story are we telling about the previous pastor's tenure? How do we think about it? How do we frame that? So why is it so important for a congregation to be very intentional about how it understands and responds to the previous pastor's tenure and departure? And Bill Owen, let's start with you on this one.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a healthy departure.
Okay.
Let's say, and so as I've said to many churches and said perhaps even in this series, that the number one predictor of success of the next pastor in the next season of the church's life is how well did you say farewell to the previous pastor? What was that departure like? And so you want to do everything that you can, given facts on the ground. You want to be grateful and at the same and acknowledge the past, celebrate the leaving of your pastor. You want to do that well, and at the same time be open to change, to face the future. So a celebration of tenure, be sure that you congratulate him or her for their leadership, mark the milestones, celebrate the memories, take time to say farewell. all of that is important. I can tell you, I've been privileged to be with churches during times of transition after long tenured pastors, and I've seen some do it just so very well. Just in the last couple of years, a 27-year tenure of a pastor, and this particular pastor is going to remain in the church. Uh, and so, but they shared all of that, what that would look like. There's a role to play there at the very beginning. You know, you're going to be asking the questions, what do we need to do now? And you're going to have time to do all of that. But before you do that, conduct an exit interview with the former pastor, sit down with them and celebrate, congratulate, gift him, her, do whatever you need to do. Because I want to tell you this, there is a grapevine out there that pastors have, and there's going to be a narrative about your church, and you want that to be a good one, a positive one, about how you said farewell and how you're facing the future. So you can do that.
So that's how to handle well a departure that took place under healthy circumstances.
Yeah.
David, from your perspective, what do we do with how do we I think Bill's statement about how you respond to the previous pastor departure is a predictor of how things are going to go in the future. That holds true, not just in how you respond to healthy departures, but also how you respond to unhealthy departures. Talk about that for us a little bit.
Yeah, so I've worked as a consultant with congregations in what we would call post-conflict cases after they've come through a difficult conflict. And often I'm involved in that stage, but there's been some cases where it's been post-conflict. The most significant were misconduct cases against a congregational leader. 4 were sexual misconduct, 1 was ethical misconduct of another nature. And those are particularly challenging because of the polarization that tends to result in the congregation, as some hear one perspective and others hear another perspective, and eventually there needs to be a shared story. It's very sensitive to work in those situations, but it is possible to still have rituals that allow people to talk about their experience and to talk about the congregation, their love for the congregation. And I will say, no matter what a pastor has done during his or her tenure, there will still be people in the congregation who love and appreciate that person. I know this firsthand because I've heard from them. And so if we have a no talk rule, which sometimes the attorneys will want to impose if there is a misconduct case, we have to respect that. But are there opportunities for people to have a listening ear for them to share what they've experienced in appropriate ways? So I cannot give general guidance. It really depends on the particular situation. But I do believe that in every situation, there are some listening rituals that are appropriate to let people express their full experience of that person's tenure and to let go in a healthy way. So there are some who will grieve and others who will be angry, and both are appropriate. How do we structure appropriate expression?
Michelle, what about you and the way that you see these kind of dynamics play out?
Can you just ask the question in brief again, real specific?
Yeah, so I mean, the what we've talked about is how are we going to interpret the previous pastor's tenure? That's the question, and that's one of the key tasks of a transition. And differences in the way that interpretation can take place can be an invitation to conflict if it's not handled well. So part of handling it well is, one, creating some space for diversity in those opinions, not all having to homogenize that answer, but making sure everyone's doing that in a healthy way. Bill talked about a healthy departure. David talked about an unhealthy departure and what we respond. Guess what I'm asking you is, right? Like, there's ditches on both sides. How do you stay out of both ditches?
Yeah, that's what I'm sitting here thinking about. What I would caution search committees about is hyperbole and pendulum swings. Like, I think that churches are really prone, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, to good pastor, bad pastor, good pastor, bad pastor. And I believe, my husband's a pastor, and I say, like, of all the places he might decide to go in his pastoral ministry, I never want him to follow the church that everybody loved, the pastor that everybody loved,
Yeah.
because you almost inevitably become the bad guy. I believe a lot in strengths and shadows. I think every pastor has strengths, every pastor has shadows. Every pastor was good at some things, every pastor was not good at some things. And I think that the truth is that we tell ourselves stories, and then we believe the stories we tell ourselves. And if we're not just giving a real honest analysis of the last pastor's tenure, we are grateful for her or his ministry. We loved the things that they did, this list of whatever. Also, we're looking forward to somebody who's a little better at administration, because that got a little messy, right? I mean, just sort of an accurate picture that is both gracious and honest about the person that you're saying goodbye to. I think it creates an environment where you're going to be able to say hello to a new person with possibility and opportunity, but also realistic expectations. So that's what I see in times of transition, that a pastor leaves and we either glorify them or we demonize them, and either one is false and either one is prone to be a ditch.
Yeah.
That's a good
to,
word.
to invite overcorrection in either direction.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Another way of saying it is congregations tend to hire to the weaknesses of their former pastor.
Right.
So whatever the clear identified weakness was, they want to make sure they hire against that. I would add to my comments earlier on, Matt, that I've given some extreme examples with misconduct cases. That's 10% of the congregations that I've worked with over the years. For the 90%, the basic principle that was articulated earlier still applies. Even if conflict hasn't risen to a level 4 or 5, those highest levels of conflict, it's very important to have a healthy farewell for the previous minister. And Bill said that very clearly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
David, can I ask just like real fast, how do you have a healthy farewell in a really extreme conflict situation or a moderately conflicted situation? What's health look like there?
So I worked with a congregation that was saying goodbye to a minister that had a fairly short tenure and a highly conflicted tenure. And we did a neutralizing history process whereby people could write things down on a 3x5 card, either things they had really appreciated about that minister or things that they were troubled by in their experience with that minister, and then had an opportunity to go outside. You don't want to do this inside with sprinklers, but to go outside with an open flame and release those. They didn't have to name them, but just to release them. And that turned out to be a very important time of kind of corporate release of that person's tenure.
In my experience, Michelle, just to echo what David's saying, been 2 or 3 transitions that I've been in that we just, as we began or right before we began the identity work, those conversations that we have congregationally, we took a weekend and just invited folks to participate in some listening sessions that were limited in size and just gave people room to name some things. And just being able, most people just need space to say it and to be heard. And that seems to have been helpful. There have been other times, and I know, Matt, you've done this as well, we've rewritten or written a covenant about how we're going to move forward together as a congregation around maybe some specific emphases that have arisen. And that exercise has proven to be helpful, healing.
Yeah. What I appreciate about the answer is that I think one could imagine that we're saying, even when there's conflict, you should have a kind of healthy departure for the sake of the future. And what I'm hearing you say is a healthy departure can be truth-telling and doesn't require sort of a disingenuous celebration party because it's going to be good for us in the future. Sometimes a good leaving is, let's be honest, and then burn it. Yeah, that's good. That's great. Thank you for that.
I'm in a church right now that their pastor left. It was not a healthy departure. And there are different ways to frame that story. Different people in the church frame that story differently. So it wasn't everyone agreed that what happened was bad or good or whatever. There was different ways to think about it. And so I think Bill's right. I think absolutely giving people an opportunity to speak matters. That went from being a conflicted system to being a unified system when people felt heard. That's one thing. The other thing too is that helped them take that journey was also recognizing that they needed to kind of cultivate their own sense of humility in that too. It's really easy for it to be, here's what I loved about the pastor, here's what I didn't like about the pastor, and to never stop and ask the question, how did I contribute, or how did I fail to contribute to this moment too? And you don't want to weaponize that. That's what often happens is people, well, if you had done this, well, if you had done this, it's more about us taking responsibility for what we did or did not do inside, and giving voice to that kind of reminds people too, right? Like we're all human in this, and that common humanity, the common humility, if people will demonstrate it, tends to be a pretty healthy way for a congregation to push the reset button in the aftermath of an unhealthy departure. So, at least in my experience,
I think all those practices are good. I think it's a good reminder that all along the way, everything needs to be transparent. Everyone needs to be invited to the table. This doesn't need to be some kind of sequestered, quiet, silent. This needs to be, everybody needs to be invited to participate.
Yeah. In the process, yeah, I think that's true. I'm assuming, Bill, you're not saying every HR issue that led to the departure.
Oh yeah. No. Just I meant, yeah, right.
I knew we assumed that that's more for the benefit of those who'll be watching this. So, there are HR issues that you have to handle
Sure.
the lens of confidentiality because of best practice. So, but that is a challenge though. It's not neat and clean just because something's an HR issue that we don't talk about it. The question is, how do you talk about it? So we've been pretty academic in this, right? Kind of 25,000 foot examining this from a distance. I want to get really kind of down to the ground now. I want to offer some really practical advice for congregational leaders in the midst of these kind of dynamics. This episode is around power dynamics, around what happens in a congregation when people are kind of exerting some control or they're wanting to pull the car of the church in a particular direction because something that's happened. So here's what I want to ask. So if somebody calls you on the telephone and says, we kind of find ourselves in the surprising moment in which this is happening in our church, like what concrete advice would you give them about how to help their church, how to help their congregation be healthy in this season of transition if these kind of dynamics are in play? And Michelle, I want to start with you.
Yeah, so I think I've said this, or we've said this in previous episodes. I would encourage a congregation to get a transition team in place as quickly as is possible. If you want to picture that metaphor of the steering wheel, and Matt, you said when nobody's in the driver's seat, I would say try everything you can to never let there be a time where no one's in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
And that could be a team of people in the driver's seat. But I think any random average congregation member should be able to tell you exactly who is in charge at all times. And for that transition team to be in front of people as often as possible, communicating as often as possible. When there's nothing to tell them, get up and tell them that there's nothing to tell them instead of asking them to guess. Assuming that they know there's nothing to tell them, just keep telling them, because nature abhors a vacuum. Leadership matters during times of transition. Continuity matters during times of transition, and communication matters. That's what I would say.
Good.
David, what about you? What practical advice would you give somebody on the other end of the telephone when they're seeing these kind of dynamics?
Well, I think right now I'll just share my current experience. I'm on the transition team of my own Mennonite congregation, and we set up a 2-year process. Church council did. I was simply asked to be one of the 7 members of the transition team. It's representative of the broader congregation. And the first year we've devoted entirely to information gathering and listening and trying to clarify identity, vision, as we've talked about earlier. We do have a consultant working with us who also is an interim minister, an intentional interim, and really a transitional pastor. Um, Personally interviewed 158 members of the congregation as part of his role. But the second year will be focused on a search committee and doing a search process in light of the recommendations that our transition team makes. Not every congregation needs a 2-year transition process, but we said farewell to a minister who retired after 28 years in the pulpit, and we thought 2 years would be appropriate for that reason. So just highlighting from my personal experience what Michelle said, and every month we have an announcement in the bulletin, and we have an announcement from the pulpit about our process. So we're trying to follow best practices as Michelle outlined them.
Bill, what about you?
I'll just give you my bullet point. What I try to say, I have this in front of me every time on a first call to some anxious presence. I say, 1, engage in spiritual discernment. Realize this is a time of spiritual reflection, a time of prayers. Discernment is not just hiring the next pastor. It's formation. This is a great opportunity for your congregation. 2, name and normalize what's going on. Be honest about what's happening. Normalizing the anxiety that you're feeling, the uncertainty that's obviously present, can reduce the fear of the unknown that everyone has. So welcome to there are plenty of other churches in the same boat you are. It's okay. 3, you want to create space for meaningful conversation. Whatever that looks like in your church, this is an opportunity for meaningful, formative conversation that will prepare you for the future. And 4th, use the interim period well. This is not dead time. It's not just a hiring process. It's sacred time. It's time to recalibrate. It's time to reflect. Be sure to use a transition coach, a transition pastor, somebody that can meet you where you are and help lead you through, as Bridges would say, through the wilderness, because that's such a great metaphor.
Yeah, the data indicates, and we've said this in an earlier episode, and in some ways the three of you just said it. Data indicates that for churches to have a healthy transition, there's 2 key things that need to be true. At least 2 key things that need to be true. 1, you need to give the congregation a role in the process. The congregation needs to have agency, and 2, you need to over communicate. And Michelle really kind of talked about both of these in her answer. What I'm going to say is, right, like when you find when there's not a leadership vacuum, when you've got a set of leaders that are going to kind of fill that vacuum, that's incredibly important, as long as those leaders are acting not primarily in their own interest, but they're acting in the interest of the entire congregation and are looking to find ways to give the congregation agency in the process. That's what good, healthy transition leadership that fills the vacuum will look like. And not only giving the congregation agency, but as Michelle said, telling people what's going on. And even when you don't have anything to tell them, we don't have anything to tell you. The consistency of that matters a lot. So I can't hammer those 2 things enough. Bill Owen's right? Spiritual discernment probably outranks those 2. But after keeping God in charge of the process and listening for the voice of God, the next step down is engage the congregation in the process and over communicate. And if you'll do those things as congregational leaders in the midst of transition, those power dynamics kind of start fading into the background, and hopefully the essential clarity of identity and unity of the congregation will come to the fore, and you'll get prepared for a great new season of ministry as a congregation. So,
I find it such a great time of since there is so much uncertainty, then invite curiosity into this period. Let's see what we can learn about one another, about ourselves, about what God wants for us, who He's calling us to become. How good is that?
Yeah.
That to me is invigorating.
Yeah, if we treat an interim season as something to be survived, we're giving up an opportunity that God gave us. to learn and to grow. So David was talking earlier about the comparison of wandering in the wilderness. We can't do it. Never works this way. But I thought to myself, we ought to really start the clock on every pastoral transition during the season of Lent, because that wilderness season, right, is the metaphor. It is what this is. Yeah. And it's hard to be in the wilderness, but it's good to be in the wilderness. The most incredible spiritual lessons tend to emerge out of not when we're all sitting on the couch eating bonbons, but when God's asking us to kind of journey and stretch ourselves a little bit. And that's what an interim season can be for you as an individual, and can also be for your entire church. So don't give up that gift by trying to button it all down and control it. So, all right, we got to finish.
One thing to that, Matt, because I just want to use the example of our church council chair. Name is Edgar. When he introduced the 7 of us last August to the congregation, he described this interim period precisely the way that you and Bill just talked about it. He said, this is an opportunity for us as a congregation to get clear about who we are and where God is calling us, and then to call a minister who can walk with us in that direction.
That's it.
And I've sensed hopefulness in the congregation ever since then.
Yep. And honestly, people, they respond to that.
It's life-giving. It is.
Yep, it is life-giving. Yeah, absolutely is. Thank you to our panel today. A lot of useful insights. I want to say to those who are going to be watching this down the road, we love being given the privilege of walking alongside congregations in this moment. It's incredibly life-giving for us to watch you have this opportunity to listen for the voice of God and grow as a congregation. So if we can help you, we'd love to be given the opportunity to help you do that. We're good at it. I know that's a patting ourselves on the back a little bit. 97% of the churches that we walk alongside in this process, we have a 97% success rate, and we define success as your pastor is still there serving happily, both from the congregation's perspective and your pastor's perspective, years after the transition is over with. We can help you start well. We can help you get your congregation very involved in the process. We can help you find excellent candidates, and not just 1 or 2, but a list of candidates that are pulled together from things that you've said are important, not that we think are important, but that you and your congregation think is important. So if we can help you, we'd love to do that. There's some more resources on our website about all of this, lots of resources around pastoral transition. So take a look at churches.org, and we'd love to help you if you think we can help you. Thanks for tuning in. Everybody have a good day.